Hello, and welcome to your video lecture for the class that we should have on January 29th. The topic of this class is Love Gone Wrong. So today we are going to be looking at a variety of things. We're going to touch on the idea of love as war, because this leads into the issue of love going wrong. So the very idea of love being a battle between two people, rather than some sort of, mutually pleasant endeavor that they're working on together, sort of foreshadows the ability of love to go wrong. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about love as war, which is also called militia amoris, which you can see at the top of this slide here. And this is a literary trope. This is a very common theme in Latin love poetry. So the idea of love as warfare has a very long history in Latin and Greek literature. Militia amoris shows up in almost all of the different genres of Latin poetry and even in prose. In its earliest examples, it simply takes the language of the military or of war and applies it to love. So it'll say, a lover is like a soldier, a love affair is like a battle, but it doesn't really elaborate any further than that. There are also examples where rather than lovers fighting against each other, we take the idea of somebody fighting against love itself. In the Hellenistic Greek era, the warfare of love idea becomes much more fully developed and much more common and popular, and then it enters into Latin literature as well, where it reaches its fully developed form. One thing that the Roman love elegists do add to the militia amoris trope is they're the first ones to come up with the idea of making Cupid or Venus a general. And the idea of Cupid or Venus as the general is what we can actually see in the slide that is up and has been up for a little while, which is from the love poet Tibullus, who is writing after Catullus but before Ovid. And here we have his poem where he's sort of contrasting love's camp and actual military service. And that's Tibullus 2:6. He says, "I am off to the camp. What will happen to tender love? Will he go too and bravely carry weapons round his neck? And will he go with his sword by the warrior's side, whether the way leads over distant lands or restless seas? Boy, brand the savage, I beg, who's broken your peace, and call the straggler back to your standard again. But if you spare soldiers, well then here's a soldier too, who'd carry sweet water for himself in his helmet. I'm off to camp, goodbye Venus, goodbye girls. I'm tough too, for me too the trumpet was created." So what do we have here? What we have here is the situation is that the lover is going off to actual war, and he's contrasting it with the warfare that he's fought for love. Note that he says, boy, call the straggler back to your standard again. Well, the standard that he's referring to is the military standard. So the flag under which a troop would rally, the flag that a troop would gather itself underneath. That's the standard. So he's imagining, he's contrasting love's camp and an actual military camp. Another way that this trope is developed in Latin literature, we can see on this slide here. This is from the poet Propertius, and he is imagining love as relating to the triumph. So the triumph is an extremely important military victory for the Romans. A Roman general who had scored a great military victory could apply for a triumph, which is this parade through the streets of Rome where his he would take all of his victorious soldiers. He would also take the soldiers that he had captured from the enemy, and he would take any booty that he'd captured from the enemy, and he would parade it through the streets of Rome for all the Romans to see and admire. At the end of this, he would perform a religious dedication to Jupiter. So there was also some important religious symbolism. And the triumph was the greatest honor that a Roman could attain in the military field. So Propertius, in this poem, you will see, basically takes some of the triumphal imagery and the actions that are found in a triumph and applies them to a love affair. He says, "Others frustrated knocked and called my lady's name. The girl, at ease, laid her head by mine. This victory's more than conquering far Parthia to me. She's my spoil, my chariot, my riches. I'll add rich gifts to your sanctuary's columns, Cynthia, and this will be the verse beneath my name. Goddess, Propertius sets these spoils before your temple. He was received as a lover for one whole night." Okay, so I've told you briefly what a triumph is. Let's look at what Propertius's triumph is. So rather than having a great military victory, he tells us that he is celebrating the fact that he was received as a lover for one whole night. This means that his mistress let him spend the night with her and ignored everybody else for the night. So he is comparing getting to spend a night with a woman with a great and glorious military victory. Then he also says that this victory is it isn't just equal to a military victory, it's better. He says this victory is more than conquering far Parthia to me. So Parthia was an empire that existed on the eastern fringes of the Roman Empire. It was one of their greatest and most important enemies in Propertius's lifetime. And the Emperor Augustus was always sort of talking about conquering them. He had a variety of minor victories over them, which were very celebrated in Rome. So Propertius here is saying that spending a single night with his girlfriend is actually better than conquering Rome's most prominent enemy at this time period. So, and then he adds, he's going to set up his victorious, he's going to give offerings to a goddess that has relationships to love rather than to war. So we do see these themes very well developed among the Roman elegists. Propertius and Tibullus, it has been suggested that they have some moral objections to real warfare, or at least to the kind of warfare that Rome was engaging in their lifetime. And they use militia amoris to express their antithesis to it and to show their choice to avoid participating in war if at all possible, especially Propertius. This idea of an anti-war attitude on behalf of the Roman elegists makes their use of military language more serious. They're not just using it as a simile. They're using it to actually try to make it seem like their lifestyles and their choices are superior to the military lifestyle, which was in fact the opposite of the way that Roman society would have put the value on those two different activities. It would have considered military lifestyle much, much superior to being a lover. That said, the trope of the militia amoris can also be used to show the humility of the lover and the degradation of its continual defeats. In the poem by Propertius, we see the lover having a rare victory. He manages to get what he wants for a night. But most of the time, when the militia amoris trope is brought in, it's the lover sort of battling with the mistress and usually losing. He usually doesn't get what he wants. So it shows him as like an unsuccessful soldier. So now let's look at Ovid and some of the Ovid poems some Ovid poems you haven't actually looked at, and then one that you have. So here we go. From the very first poem of Ovid's Amores, Ovid sets up love as love and war as related, although in that poem he makes them opposite. So he says, just now I was preparing to start with heavy fighting and violent war, with a measure to fit the matter. So he claims that his initial plan for writing poetry was to write about war. Shortly, in the lines immediately after this, which are not on the slide, he basically says that Cupid spoiled his plans and made him write about love instead. In the next poem, Amores 1-2, Ovid provides us with another image of love's triumph, and this image does draw upon Propertius's earlier discussion of the idea, which you saw a few slides back. And so this is from Ovid Amores 1.2. It says, "Wreath your hair with myrtle, yoke your mother's doves. Your stepfather Mars himself will lend you a chariot. And it's fitting you go, the people acclaiming your triumph. With you skillfully handling the yoked birds, leading captive youths and captive girls, that procession will be a magnificent triumph. I myself, fresh prize, will just now have received my wounds, and my captive mind will display its new chains. You'll lead conscience, hands twisted behind her back, and shame, and whoever love's sect includes. All will fear you, stretching their arms toward you. The crowd will cry, hurrah for the triumph. You'll have your flattering followers, delusion and passion, the continual crew that follows at your side." This is an extremely detailed take on an actual Roman triumph. But with Cupid, also called Amor, which is the Roman word for love, Cupid is the general. So instead of the lover as a general, it's Cupid as a general, and the lover is a victim. So we do have this extremely detailed comparison with the triumph. For instance, he says, your stepfather Mars will lend you a chariot, which will be yoked with your mother's doves. So in the actual triumph, the general would ride in a chariot and through the streets of Rome, as does Cupid here in this imagination. As I said, in an actual triumph, the triumphing general would display all of the captives that he had taken on his campaign. And here we have captives too. We have captive youths and captive girls. So those are the people who are, the lovers that he has captured with his love triumph. But not just them. We've also got some virtues. Conscience and shame have also been captured and are being led through the streets in triumph because they have been overcome by love. Love has made people forget about their conscience and their sense of shame. And for his soldiers, he has delusion and passion. So this is another idea. This also shows us a little something about how the Romans think of as love. About love. Love is something that overcomes your better virtues by means of things, a deluded passion. Also in Book 1 of the Amores, and this one was on your reading list for today, Ovid explicitly compares a lover to a soldier. So he says, "Every lover's in arms, and Cupid holds the fort. Atticus, believe me, every lover's in arms. The age that's good for war is also good for love. An old soldier's a disgrace, and an old lover. That spirit a commander looks for in a brave army, a lovely girl looks for in a love partner. Both keep watch, both sleep on the ground. One serves at his lady's entrance, the other his general's." So the lover is explicitly likened to a soldier, but he is fighting in love's army instead of the Roman army. Ovid argues for love as a dangerous and difficult task, just like actual war. And he takes this idea farther than any of the previous love poets, as we might by now expect, in that he very literally goes through the different things that a soldier does and says, okay, but this is how a lover would do it. So the sleeping on the ground, that kind of thing. Moving on, Catullus here also uses the idea of love as war, although in a much more casual and less sustained way than we see in the later Latin love poets. So we should not expect to see the same kind of very detailed and sustained comparisons that we see in Ovid in Catullus. In Catullus, it's more likely to be, brief mentions or brief comparisons or similes. So here in 37, this poem is: lecherous tavern and you its regulars, 9 pillars along from the twins' pillars. Do you think you're the only ones with cocks? The only ones who are allowed to trouble young girls and consider the rest of us goats? Or, because 100 or 2 of you sit in a row, you dullards, that I daren't bugger 200 together? Think on, I'll draw all over the front of the tavern with your leavings. Because my girl, who's left my arms, whom I loved as no other girl's ever been loved, for whom so many battles were fought, is there. All right. So some of the language of this poem we'll maybe talk about a little bit later when we talk about Catullan invective, which is hate poetry. You doubtless have noticed that he is being obscene in this poem. So it's actually kind of interesting, the way that he puts these two things together in one poem. He puts this obscenity and insults to other men who he suspects of having designs on Lesbia. But then near the end, we get this sort of wistful, gentler almost tone in the last 4 lines. It is in there where he talks about the battles. So he imagines the process of achieving the love affair with Lesbia had involved him fighting battles, not real ones, but metaphorical battles. And so we have the idea of battles of love in here. But of course, this poem also helps us segue into kind of the main theme of today, which is love gone wrong, because it is also very clear in this poem that something has gone very wrong with Catullus and Lesbia's relationship. He seems to suspect her of wrongdoing. He says that his girlfriend is in the tavern with all of these men who he doesn't think very highly of. He's not attacking her yet at this point, other than saying that she's in there with these people. But he certainly is there are certainly other poems where he does attack her in very insulting terms. Catullus 37 is one of a group of poems that show the disillusionment of the lover and the end of the affair with Lesbia. Although note that they are interspersed with the poems in which the affair is still happening and happy. The collection really isn't chronological. In many of these poems, Catullus dwells on the betrayals he believes Lesbia has committed. And he blames these betrayals as what has caused their love to go wrong. As we can see in the next slide, where he's very explicit about what kind of betrayals he sees her committing. He says, "Let her live and be happy with her adulterers, holding all 300 in her embrace, truly loveless, wearing them all down again and again. Let her not look for my love as before, she whose crime destroyed it, like the last flower of the field, touched once by the passing plow." All right, so once again, we have this juxtaposition of obscenity and sort of touching poetic things. As I note on the slide, the line "wearing them all down again and again," the Latin is actually a lot more obscene than that. It's almost untranslatable. It's so obscene. But then we go into this lovely little simile about how she destroyed his love like it was a flower in the field. This simile has received a great deal of scholarly attention. For one thing, it is very similar to a simile we find in one of Sappho's poems. And you may remember from our first lecture that Catullus was heavily influenced by Sappho. It also suggests a few things about Catullus and Lesbia. First, Catullus is the flower. Does this feminize him? To some extent, especially when we consider the way that he, the sentence that the flower is in. like the last flower of the field touched once by the passing plow. In Latin literature, it's usually girls who are compared to flowers, not men. But more importantly here, a flower touched by the passing plow. The plow isn't aware of the flower. The plow isn't trying to destroy the flower. The plow is just wandering along doing its own thing. So this almost suggests that Lesbia is like a force vastly outside of Catullus' control, who just does what she wants and doesn't even really notice him. So it really, really makes his role in all of this very minor and very unimportant, and emphasizes just how much more invested in the affair he was than she was. All right. Now I'm going to move on to another Catullus poem on this slide. This is Catullus 58, which says, Caelius, our Lesbia, that Lesbia Catullus alone loved more than himself, and all of his own, now at crossroads and down alleyways, jerks off the brave sons of Rome. So once again, we have this thing where Catullus takes this sort of high-flown, poetic, romantic language. Catullus alone loved more than himself and all of his own. And then quick right turn into obscenity. This is very, very common of, it's very characteristic of Catullus' style to throw obscenity into a poem sort of surprisingly, to grab your attention, to quickly shift in tone that way. But it also, once again, really showcases this idea of love that has quite suddenly, from Catullus' perspective, gone wrong. These poems are supposed to showcase the idea of a real mental struggle between, love and longing and disgust and hatred. A struggle that is really, really emphasized in the last poem of Catullus we're going to look at, which is right here. And this is Catullus 75, or the last poem we're going to look at today, I should say. My mind's reduced to this by your faults, Lesbia, and has ruined itself so in your service that now it couldn't wish you well were you to become what's best, or stop loving you if you do what's worst. He doesn't know what to do. He's really, really desperately torn between loving her and hating her, between wanting to get her back and wanting the affair to end and not have anything more to do with her. And this really showcases the idea that love is not a simple thing, that it can come from outside of you and, make you do things that are against your better judgment. And this goes back to the ideas that we've seen in other places with love as a general, or love as an enemy. It forces you to do things you don't want to do. It takes you over. Your conscience and your better judgment just go out the door because you were just overcome by delusion and passion. And there are still other poems in Catullus. There's no real indication that Catullus gets over Lesbia. He keeps talking about her. There's never a poem that's just this definitive, okay, we're done forever. They are always undercut by this desire to keep trying to get her back. Okay, so the rest of this lecture is going to be looking at Aeneid 4. This is a very complicated piece of poetry, and it merits a lot of discussion, and there's a great deal of love and also hate in this poem. Of course, as I've said, the topic of this class as a whole is love, hate, and power. Those three themes are very much intertwined in Aeneid 4, as we see a love affair go horribly wrong, leading into hate between not just two individuals, but between two entire peoples, because of the power dynamics that are tied in. The people in the love affair are rulers, and there's also a lot of interference from the gods. Before we look at book 4, though, I'm going to briefly introduce Virgil. Here he is. So Virgil's full name is Publius Vergilius Maro. We call him Virgil in English, though. He was born in 70 BCE in Mantua, which is modern Mantova in northern Italy. He died in 19 BCE. He is the greatest epic poet of the Augustan era, arguably the greatest of all the Latin epic poets. He remained dominant as the greatest Latin poet up until our own times. So Virgil, like most of our other authors that we're studying this year, was not born in Rome, and he was not from the senatorial class, but he was still born into a wealthy family. He was born into an equestrian landowning family, which could afford to give him a very good education. He attended schools in a variety of places, including Rome and Naples. He seems to have briefly considered a career in rhetoric and law before he turned his talents to poetry. Virgil makes admiring references to writers who are associated with Catullus, particularly two men named Pollio and Cinna. This leads some people to believe that he may have been briefly associated with the Neoteric circle that Catullus was part of. Virgil was a great success in Rome from the time that he published his first poems, the Eclogues, and he soon gained the patronage of Maecenas, the close friend of Augustus. The Eclogues were pastoral poetry. This is poetry that is set in usually a rural setting, and the characters in it are shepherds and people, shepherds and shepherdesses and that type of people. Maecenas, as I said, he gained the patronage of Augustus's friend Maecenas. Maecenas was a extremely wealthy man who was close friends with Augustus, but opted out of having an official political career. He ended up doing some political things, but kind of always as Augustus's friend rather than as an elected official or anything like that. One of the things that he did was act as a kind of unofficial minister of culture. So Maecenas was the patron of a lot of poets in this time period, which basically meant that he would try to discover promising young poets, and then he would give them encouragement, usually in the form of exposure and introductions to the right people rather than monetary. Although if somebody was, in the rare occasion when somebody was actually poor, he might help them with money as well. He also could help them if they had legal problems. Virgil's family, for instance, had lost some of their land. It had been confiscated by Augustus, but Virgil's connection with Maecenas seems to have made some of those problems go away, and they got their land back, or they got equivalent land back. After he got the patronage of Maecenas, he wrote, pardon me. He wrote a poem called the Georgics, which is an epic poem about farming. It's sort of an instructional manual. Again, this may sound odd, but trust me, this was a normal thing in antiquity. And then finally, he wrote the Aeneid. According to tradition, Virgil traveled to Greece around 19 BCE in order to revise the Aeneid. After meeting Augustus in Athens and deciding to return home, Virgil caught a fever while visiting a town in Greece. He then still got on the ship to Italy, but he was significantly weakened by his illness and died in the harbor of Brundisium, which is in Italy. So he died in the place where he kind of touched down back in Italy. The Aeneid was still not done. The Aeneid, as we have it, is not in its final form. It's mostly done, but Virgil wasn't done revising it. And Virgil actually had requested on his deathbed that the poem be burned. He didn't think it was done. He didn't think it was ready. He didn't want anybody to read it. But Augustus intervened. He would not allow Virgil's literary executors to burn the poem. He instead ordered it published with as few changes as possible. As a result, the text of the Aeneid may include some faults Virgil was intending to correct, but the only obvious imperfections are that there are few lines of verse that aren't finished. So lines are supposed to have, this very specific structure, and some of them are too short. They're not done. Other alleged imperfections are subject to scholarly debate, and nobody can really agree, did he mean to leave it this way or not? One thing we do know is that the poem wasn't supposed to be any longer. It does end where it's supposed to end, because that's not the kind of corrections that Virgil was working on. He had written everything he intended to written. It was just a matter of revising, not actually changing the plot in any significant way. Okay, so now I'm going to briefly introduce the Aeneid before we start looking at some passages from Book 4. All right. So the Aeneid is a heroic epic. It tells the tale of the adventures of a hero who was associated with the Trojan War. Virgil is writing in the same tradition as Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. But unlike Homer, he is composing in writing. So the Iliad and the Odyssey were originally composed orally, and they were only written down after they'd existed as oral poems for a long time. The Aeneid was always existed as a written poem. Virgil recasts his Homeric inspiration in a way that is very Roman and very Virgilian. One big example of the differences between Homeric and Virgilian epic is the value system. So the value system of Homeric epic celebrates heroic individualism. It looks at the individual improving and protecting and exercising his own heroism. So for instance, the plot of the Iliad is about, it boils down to Achilles got mad, and then Achilles did what he wanted, which was withdrawing from the fighting, and everything was terrible because the Greeks were losing without Achilles on their side. And then eventually the Greeks had to convince Achilles to fight again. This sort of idea of protecting one's own heroism, even at the cost of the group, is not one that would have flown in Rome at this time period. His heroic values would have been anachronistic and inappropriate in a poem written for readers in Rome in the 1st century BCE, because they required their leaders to live according to a more social ideal suited to a sophisticated urban civilization. In Rome, ideal leaders were supposed to be heroes, yes, but they were also supposed to subsume their own desires to the good of Rome. Therefore, although Virgil set the action of his poem in a legendary age contemporary with the Trojan War, and long before Rome existed, one must judge the characters of his poem by the standards of the poet's own time. So his characters don't act like characters who had actually been written by Homer would act. They act much more like Romans. The Aeneid also often gives evidence of a great deal of meaning beyond the narrative level. Virgilian narrative can be read and enjoyed as a story. That is absolutely a level on which you can enjoy this poem. But it is densely packed with symbolic meaning. Frequently there are references to Roman history. Virgil recounts the legend of Aeneas because he believes it has meaning for Roman history and for his own times. He has not arbitrarily chosen this story. He's chosen it because he thinks it will be meaningful to the people of his own time. For example, the destruction of Troy that results in the wandering of Aeneas to find a new life in the West can be seen as a parallel to the history of Rome in the 1st century BCE, which included both the violent destruction of the Republic and the creation of peace and order by Augustus. Also suggestive of recent Roman history, particularly the civil wars, is the kind of civil war between the Trojans and their Italian allies that takes up most of the latter half of the Aeneid. Aeneas's victory over the Italians in this civil war suggests Augustus's ending of Roman civil wars. And finally, the Carthaginian queen Dido, who is going to be featured in the readings we look at today, almost forgets the Carthaginian queen Dido is in a metaphor for a couple of different things. Well, first she reminds the reader of Cleopatra. Just like Dido distracts Aeneas temporarily and almost permanently from his duty to Rome, Cleopatra in this time period was seen to have distracted Antony. Dido's story also provides a legendary explanation for the historical hostility between the countries of Rome and Carthage. This was the cause of 3 very major wars in the 200 years before Virgil's time, between Dido's people and Aeneas's people, essentially. And these wars were considered to be very important for making Rome what it was in Virgil's time. There are also a lot of recurring images in the Aeneid, such as snakes, wound, fire, hunting, and storms. And they have narrative place in that, yes, you want to have hunting scenes in epic. That's normal. Storms are normal in epic. But they also have a lot of symbolic meaning. 2 of the most important recurrent words in the Aeneid are fury and are furor, which is a noun that means violent madness or frenzy or fury, and its associated verb furere, to rage. So the Aeneid is full of raging madness. These words have important meaning for the characters in the Aeneid to whom they are applied and for evaluating their behavior. And in addition, these 2 words connect the legendary world of the Aeneid to the Roman politics of the 1st century BCE, which were often described as characterized by fury and rage and mindless passion and desires. We can see some of these images recurring in Book 4, the heart of the Dido and Aeneas story, and a foundational example of love gone wrong. So Book 4 is really about the tragedy of Dido. Here is the first slide. So the first 3 lines on this slide introduce the dominant images of the book. What are these dominant images and to what do they refer? Well, we have wounding, hurt, blood, fire, intense love. These are the dominant images of Book 4. The idea of love as something that wounds, that hurts, which we talked about last week, and this image of blood and fire. Be alert for the appearance of these words or images throughout the book, and try to determine what kind of comment they make on her fate. For a book that at least starts out about love, these are very ominous images. Also take a look at these lines for what attracts Dido to Aeneas. She's attracted by his courage and his nobility, by the way he looks and his words. So she's attracted to him for a variety of different reasons. And this is important that they talk about his courage and nobility first, because this isn't just a physical attraction. This is also an emotional relationship. And she's also attracted to virtuous characteristics that would be useful to her in a practical sense. So his courage and his nobility suggest that he would be a good match, and that given that she is a queen, suggests that he would be, a good counterpart for her, a good king. He's courageous and noble. Those are characteristics you want in a king. The idea at the end of this passage about how love will not grant restful calm to her body actually aligns Dido as well with the lover that we have seen in the poetry of Catullus and Ovid. Lovers can't rest. Male lovers who are desperately and terribly overwhelmed and deluded and passionate, they have trouble sleeping, and so does Dido. Okay, so let's move on now from the first slide to this one. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we can see that her love has made her break a vow. Well, it's going to make her break a vow. She has vowed to never remarry after her first husband died. He was actually murdered by her brother, and that murder is the reason why she has gone to found a new city. But another thing that these lines do is they emphasize the idea of this love being very ill-omened. The love is ill-omened from the very start. It is painful for Dido, sure, that's normal for love, but she's also, in order for this love to be fulfilled, she is going to have to break a sacred vow. This is a big deal for the Romans, and means that their love is going to be ill-omened from the very start. This is foreshadowing for bad things to come in this affair. I would like to note, however, that another thing we can see on the lines on this slide is that Dido always thinks of her desire as related to marriage. She says, "If my mind was not set never to join myself with any man in the bonds of marriage, if I were not wearied by marriage and bridal beds." She's thinking of Aeneas as a potential husband. She is not looking for an extramarital affair, and this is going to become important later. So in this next slide here, we have some more foreshadowings of doom, where Dido, who at this point has not yet decided to follow through her desire and her love, is saying that she would rather all of these very terrible things happen to her before she break her vow to her dead husband and take up a marriage with Aeneas. She would rather have the earth gape open or be hit by lightning. These are things that happen to oathbreakers in antiquity. These are things that happen to people who offend against the gods in legends. And Dido is saying that these things should happen to her if she breaks the vow. On this slide, we see the words of Dido's sister Anna, who is trying to persuade her that she should pursue a relationship with Aeneas. Anna's focus is on, again, it's on practical matters. She says, "What a city you'll see here, what a kingdom, with a Trojan army marching with us, with what great actions Punic glory will soar." So this is not just about love, this relationship that Anna is encouraging Dido to pursue. Anna very rightly suggests that Dido could use a strong husband with experienced men to protect her and to grow the city. Dido, as I said, is on the run because her brother murdered her husband, and she has founded a new city, and so far she seems fairly successful. But Dido is a young and marriageable woman, and she is in a difficult situation. Women did not usually lead kingdoms in antiquity. They don't usually in legend unless they're goddesses or partially goddesses. And Dido's not. Dido's human. Dido has had to sort of fend off a variety of suitors from the peoples around Carthage. And she has managed to do it by saying, oh no, she took this vow to her husband, she'd never remarry. But Anna, makes a very good point that they would be in a much better situation if Dido had a husband. If Dido had a husband, and then Dido could have children, and there could be heirs for the kingdoms, and also, a husband would protect her to some extent from aggression by foreign enemies. And, there's a further good thing here. Aeneas has no city of his own, so he wouldn't just be trying to take over her territory and add it to his. This is another issue that she's had with marrying any of her neighbors, is that her city would lose its autonomy, basically. It would just become part of another kingdom. Aeneas doesn't have a kingdom. Aeneas' kingdom has been destroyed. He is an exile. He's looking for a place to be. So keep looking for these logical, practical aspects of the relationship, and ask yourself as you're reading, who ignores these aspects, these reasons for the relationship, and why do they do so? So after Anna has talked to Dido, Dido is still not convinced. She's still sort of not sure she wants to pursue the love. But she is also being tormented. We saw from the very beginning that love is pain and torture for Dido, and it only gets worse the longer she resists it, as we see on this slide, which has a fairly famous simile comparing Dido to a deer who has been shot but not killed and is, running through the woods trying to escape the pain. Again, the way that this illustrates Dido's love is very instructive and has a lot of very ominous foreshadowing. Love was trying to kill her, basically. A hunter. She is like a deer that's been struck by a shepherd. It also, the simile here also takes the blame away from any human action. So we have, like an unwary deer struck by an arrow, that a shepherd hunting with his bow has fired at from a distance in the Cretan woods, leaving the winged steel in her without knowing. So in the simile, the deer has no idea where the arrows come from, and the shepherd doesn't know he's hit her. Nobody's really to blame here. So the simile takes blame away from both parties in this love affair. Another question you might want to ask is, who is the shepherd? Is it Aeneid? Is it Amor? Love? Cupid? It's not entirely clear. Here in our next slide, we have, again, Dido still trying to resist the desire for Aeneas. As his hostess, she is leading him around her city and showing him what she has done and what she possesses. We can relate this back to Anna's speech. Remember, Anna suggested that, having Aeneas could improve their city. So Dido here is, in a way, she's showing Aeneas what she has to offer. She's offering more than just herself. She wants to make him a king here. She wants to give him a home and a life. She's looking for marriage. She's basically showing him her dowry, the wealth and city that she brings with her. But she's still unable to confess her love because she is still resisting the idea that she is in love. She does not want to break the vow to her husband, or to her first husband. All right. This slide here, we are still in the part of the story before Dido gives into the love, before they make their marriage. And while Dido is distracted by unrequited love, this is the point where it is very destructive, not just for her, but also for her people, for her city. The towers she started no longer rise, the young men no longer carry out their drill or work on the harbor and the battlements for defense and war. The interrupted work is left hanging, the huge threatening walls, the sky-reaching cranes. So while Dido is distracted and has not yet entered into a relationship with Aeneas, nothing's getting done. All she can think about is her love, her desire, and while it is unfulfilled, she can't concentrate on anything else, and because she's the queen, that means nobody's getting anything done. She's not giving orders, and so things just aren't happening. This connects to the idleness of love. This is a theme we see in Elegy as well. The idea that lovers just don't get anything done because they're too distracted by love. When Dido is love-sick, she can't do anything, and so the whole city stops. This is a bit of a problem for Juno, and now we're going to bring the gods in. Juno is the goddess who is special, particularly special to Dido and to Carthage. So Juno is their patron goddess. And Juno is not pleased that Dido has fallen in love with Aeneas and is distracted. Now, there's another thing that's important to know here that happened before the beginning of Book 4. Dido is in love with Aeneas because Venus made her fall in love with Aeneas. Dido it wasn't just a spontaneous, she met Aeneas and just fell for him. When she first sees him, she likes him, she's polite to him, but she is not in love with him. It's not love at first sight. The love happens when Venus decides that it would be a good idea for Dido to fall in love with Aeneas and to help him. So this is really important because the love affair between Dido and Aeneas is orchestrated and manipulated by two goddesses who have a lot more power than the humans involved do. Okay, so here we are with our passage Aeneid 4.99 to 104. In this passage, the goddess Juno is speaking, and she is speaking to the goddess Venus. Juno suggests that she and Venus conspire to make a marriage between Dido and Aeneas. So, let's talk a little bit about some background here. First, Juno hates Aeneas. This is really important to know. I will talk on another day about why she hates him, but just so you know, she hates him. She hates him and loves Dido. So why does she want them to get married? Well, she does hate Aeneas, but one of the reasons she hates him is because he's going to found Rome, and she doesn't want him to do that, again, for reasons I'll talk about in a different class. And she thinks that if she can get him to marry Dido and stay in Carthage, he will never found Rome. And so a bunch of the reasons for why she hates him will just go away. Also, she, like Dido's sister Anna, agrees that Dido could use a strong husband to help her and to protect the city that she's founding. So as far as Juno's concerned, if Aeneas marries Dido, it will solve a bunch of her problems all at once. So now let's talk about Venus, because Venus is going to agree to this plan. All right, so Venus cares about this whole situation because Venus is Aeneas's mother. We are talking about the legendary heroic age where gods and goddesses did sometimes have half-human, semi-divine children. So Venus is on Aeneas' side always because she is his mother and she wants to protect him and she wants him to fulfill his fate. But marrying Dido will mean that he's distracted from his fate. Well, that's true, but Venus, for the short term, Venus just wants to protect Aeneas and make sure that he is happy and successful and continues to stay alive and stuff. And getting an alliance with Dido is a good way for her to make sure that Aeneas is protected in the short term, that he has a secure place to live and property and all that. And from Venus's perspective, he can always leave Dido later if he wants to. So we have here a combination of love and practicality. The goddesses themselves say, okay, this is a practical relationship. All right, next slide. So this is the actual marriage, the making of the marriage between Dido and Aeneas. Or the plans that the goddesses make for the marriage. Juno declares that she will create a set of circumstances that will make Dido and Aeneas go into the same cave, and there she will make a marriage for them. Juno declares that it's going to be a marriage, not an affair, not something extramarital. And it is important to remember this. And the reason it's important is because later on in this book, there's going to be some dispute about whether or not Dido and Aeneas were married, and there are good reasons for that dispute. But at this point, what you need to know is Juno says it will be a marriage, and Juno is the goddess of marriage. So if she can't decide what is and isn't a marriage, who can? All right. This right here is just a brief slide with a mosaic showing a slightly later interpretation of Aeneas and Dido going out on the hunt, which is when the marriage happens. Those are capes flying out behind them, not wings on the horses. All right. But now, more importantly, here is a slide that has some more lines from the Aeneid on it. And this describes their actual wedding. So let's talk a little bit about this in comparison to a normal Roman wedding ceremony. Okay, so primeval Earth and Juno of the nuptials give their signal. Okay, so Earth and Juno are the ones who are, I suppose, presiding over this whole thing. The nymphs howl on the mountain heights. So what we have here is Earth and Juno as witnesses of the marriage, and the nymphs singing a wedding hymn, sort of. So who officiates this marriage? Juno, the goddess of marriage. Okay, well that seems pretty legitimate. But then let's talk about these circumstances. We've got lightning flashes, we've got nymphs not singing but howling. These are not exactly good omens for their marriage. And even though Juno has approved the marriage, and even though Dido thinks it's a marriage, it's not exactly a marriage that starts in the best of circumstances. And the narrator says, Dido's no longer troubled by appearances or reputation. She no longer thinks of a secret affair. She calls it marriage, and with that name disguises her sin. So this actually brings me to something that I wanted to talk about, which is how the narrator and the events might not tell the same story or have the same perspective. So what is the story here? Dido and Aeneas have entered into a relationship in a cave. The story tells us that Juno approved of it, and that Juno considers it a marriage. There has also been nothing in the poem so far to suggest that Dido wouldn't consider it a marriage. Dido is looking for a husband, not a lover. And in that case, the sort of narrator's intervention here, that Dido's no longer troubled by appearances or reputation, doesn't make a lot of sense. Ancient marriages in general, basically it worked like this. If two people thought they were married and acted like they were married, they were married. And as we're going to see, Dido and Aeneas act like they're married. So there isn't really any fault or sin that Dido needs to be hiding here. By the rules of her society, she's married. And also I'd like to point out the line, she no longer thinks of a secret affair. She never thought of a secret affair. That was never in Dido's plans. Dido has always thought of this as a marriage. So the narrator may have perspectives that don't fit with the information that we have been given so far. And that's fine. There can be multiple perspectives inside of a narrative. All right, so here we have another divine force that comes in and starts messing with people. And this is Fama, or rumor, which is kind of a personified... Yeah, Fama is rumor is thought of as a goddess, a winged goddess that travels around and spreads rumors. Rumor is gossiping about Aeneas and Dido. But one thing we might want to ask is rumor reliable? Again, we have a narrator in the story that's not necessarily reliable. Rumor, the lines themselves say that rumor sings fact and fiction alike. So what does rumor say is happening? Rumor says that Dido and Aeneas are spending the whole winter together in indulgence, forgetting their royalty, trapped by shameless passion. Now, a few slides from now, we are going to see something that suggests that this is part of the fiction, that this is not actually true. But now I want to point out one of the reasons why this is here. I said at the beginning of my talk about the Aeneas that Dido is a kind of a stand-in for Cleopatra. Similar rumors to this floated about Cleopatra, both with Julius Caesar and with Antony. That when Caesar and then later Antony were with Cleopatra, they were hanging around, indulging themselves in pleasure and passion when they should have been working. So this particular line might actually have less to do with Dido and more to do with Cleopatra. All right, next line here. So After one of the people that rumor goes to is a king named Yarbus, who is a king of the nearest territory and a rejected suitor of Dido's. He's also a son of Jupiter. And in these lines, it is clear he is angry. He is angry that Dido has taken Aeneas in marriage. He's angry because she rejected him, and the reason she gave him was her vow to her husband. So he's a rejected suitor, basically, and rumor has made him angry, which is a threat to Dido. Note, though, that he does see the relationship as marriage. Okay. So, what happens next? Here we have a slide, and in this slide, we are actually talking about Mercury. So that's who the he of the first line is. Mercury is a messenger god, and Jupiter has sent Mercury to Aeneas to tell Aeneas that he needs to get out of Carthage. All right, so why is Jupiter doing this? So we've already talked about how Juno and Venus sort of intervened and conspired to get Dido and Aeneas together. And I mentioned in that section about how Juno doesn't want Aeneas to found Rome. All right, so here's the thing. It is Aeneas's fate to find Rome. To found Rome, not to find Rome. And Jupiter is a god who is very concerned about fate. He does not like it when other gods get in the way of fate or try to stop fate. And so Jupiter has finally noticed that Aeneas is not doing what he's fated to do, and so he has sent Mercury to Carthage to remind Aeneas of his fate and the fact that he needs to get on it. So that's why Mercury is there. But the other thing I wanted to point out here in this passage is these lines. He saw Aeneas establishing towers and altering roofs. His sword was starred with tawny jasper, and the cloak that hung from his shoulder blazed with Tyrian purple. A gift that rich Dido had made, weaving the cloth with golden thread. What is Aeneas doing, and what is he wearing? And there's the significance of these things. Well, first, when Mercury gets there, Aeneas is supervising the building works. So remember how the building had stopped when Dido was lovesick? Well, now that Dido and Aeneas have formed their marriage, the building is going again, and Aeneas is supervising it. He is doing what kings are supposed to do. He's making sure the city is built. He's making sure that defenses are established. He is supervising, and he's doing exactly what he should be doing. And what has Dido been doing? Well, Dido, we find out, has made him a cloak. Dido has been weaving. Dido has been doing women's work. She's been doing the work that she's supposed to be doing. The work that wives do. Wives in this time period are supposed to make their husbands' clothes. So basically, contrary to what rumor had said, so rumor, you may recall, had said that they've been sitting around doing nothing all winter. But when Mercury gets there, the evidence is very different from that. The evidence suggests that no, they have been doing exactly what the married couple is supposed to be doing, a married couple of their status. So in this slide, we see Aeneas' reaction to Mercury's visit. So as soon as Aeneas is reminded by Mercury of what he is supposed to do, he immediately, I suppose, comes to his senses and realizes that he has been distracted from his duty and that he needs to get on with founding Rome. He is, however, reluctant to talk to Dido, as though he knows it will not go well. So Aeneas is brought out of the sort of spell that Venus has put upon them, Venus and Juno, but Dido hasn't. And then, so his solution to this problem, which we see in this slide, is to deceive her, basically. He tells his men to get ready, but he tells them not to tell anyone why they're getting ready, not to tell them that they're planning to leave. He instead decides that he is going to just sort of get ready to leave and hope that a good moment comes for telling Dido. This is the point where Aeneas's characterization starts to go bad a little bit. Because Aeneas knows he is about to do something that is going to cause Dido great distress. And Dido has never tried to deceive him. So Aeneas is being deceptive to somebody who simply does not deserve it. But he's being deceptive in order to fulfill his fate, which means that ultimately his deception can be justified on a public level, if not on a personal level. In this slide, we see that Aeneas' deception is pointless anyway, because Dido soon finds out what's going on. She is the queen of this city, and of course she knows what's happening in it. And she immediately is returned to a very similar state as she was in before their marriage. She is being tormented. She raves, she's on fire. So the burning again. We might wonder if love is her tormentor here or if something else is. So before she was being tormented by her unrequited love. Now love, yes, perhaps, but also anger at the deception of Aeneas. The simile here about the Maenads, who are the female followers of Bacchus, the god of wine, is telling. The Maenads were women who they engage in ecstatic rites of the god Dionysus or Bacchus, and they could be considered to be dangerous. So unlike in the earlier simile where she's compared to a deer, she has gone from being a kind of a gentle prey creature to a Maenad, which is a predator creature. They are dangerous. They have been in myth, they sometimes tear men apart. And that tells us something about kind of a switch here from Dido as the victim of love to Dido as a potential enemy and a potential danger to Aeneas, although still not necessarily through any fault of her own. She has been deceived and manipulated by forces that are much greater than she is. And this brings us to here where Dido confronts Aeneas. And she says, "Faithless one, did you really think you could hide such wickedness and vanish from my land in silence? Will my love not hold you, nor the pledge I once gave you, nor the promise that Dido will die a cruel death?" Dido presents Aeneas as a betrayer. How can he stay a hero after this, after he has betrayed the bonds of a marriage that he made? Well, he can stay a hero because Dido's not a Roman, and I'm going to talk about that later. But at this moment in the poem, Aeneas is not looking terribly heroic. So Dido is in danger. She says Dido will die a cruel death. So she could be alluding to suicide, but she also could be alluding to the very real danger that the neighboring states present to her. Remember, we saw that Iarbas is very angry at her, and it is entirely possible that once Aeneas is gone, not just she, but her people, her city, will come under attack from her neighbors. All right, next slide. She begs him to stay. She begs him not to leave her. She begs him by their union, by anything that she ever did that was nice, anything he ever, or if he ever cared, by any pledge they had made. There are a number of issues here that she brings up. First, we have the guest host issue. When Aeneas originally arrives in Carthage, he is as a guest to Dido. The guest host relationship in antiquity was a very serious one. There weren't really hotels, and so wealthy sort of upper class people would form these relationships with other upper class people that were sacred and protected by the gods. You weren't allowed to break them, or you risked divine disfavor. Well, Dido is suggesting that Aeneas is breaking this guest host bond. He's also breaking the bonds of friendship, which were also very serious in antiquity. And of course, there is the marriage bond issue. Aeneas is about to deny they were ever married. But again, they acted like they were married. He acted like a husband. If he was just her lover, he would not have been supervising the building works of her city. And other people thought they were married. Certainly the other people of Carthage did, and so did Iarbas, the neighboring king. In this next slide, we get Dido sort of realizing that Aeneas is about to deny their marriage, but she does bring up the guest issue again, and she reiterates and specifies the dangers that she is facing, both from her brother, who could still try and find her and finish off the work he had done in destroying her husband, and also from her neighbors. So she is presenting a lot of very strong reasons why she really does not want Aeneas to betray her and leave her. Now we move on to Aeneas' reply to Dido. In this reply, he admits that she has treated him well. He says, "I will never deny that you deserve the most that can be spelt out in speech, nor will I regret my thoughts of you, Alyssa." He also says, "I did not expect to conceal my departure by stealth." Do we believe him? Maybe. He did tell his men to conceal the fact that they were about to leave. And then he says, "Nor have I ever held the marriage torch or entered into that pact." Again, we are allowed to doubt whether he's telling the truth here. He denies their marriage, but the things he denies are not actually necessary to make a marriage, Roman or otherwise. And remember that neither Dido nor Aeneas is a Roman. So holding the marriage torch and having a specific marriage agreement, a pact, those are optional things that many people did in their marriages, but they didn't have to be done. The only thing that has to happen to make a marriage in antiquity is that the two people act like they're married, the two people act like they're married, and other people think they're married. And Dido and Aeneas have done that. So after Aeneas makes his speech, we have this speech from Dido. Dido begins by focusing on her emotions. Basically, he didn't care that I was sad. But then she moves on from the emotions fairly quickly to the other things he has done wrong. She welcomed him as a castaway on the shore, a beggar, and foolishly gave away part of my kingdom. I saved his lost fleet and his friends from death. Now this is getting back again to that guest host issue. All other things, if we just don't even consider the marriage issue, the way that Aeneas is acting is a way that does not respect the help she has given him. The trying to sort of sneak away in the night, this is very disrespectful of a ruler who has done nothing but give him help. Aeneas listens to her, but he can't really respond because he knows he's going to leave. And then we see in these lines his internal reaction. So he's struggling. He desired to ease her sadness by comforting her and to turn aside pain with words. Still, with much sighing and a heart shaken by the strength of her love, he followed the divine command and returned to the fleet. So in the other poems we looked at today, we saw these internal struggles as well, where we have a character who wants one thing but knows he has to do the other. But with Aeneas, it's, he wants to stay with Dido. His desires, his individual desires, are to stay with Dido. But he has to subsume those desires to the greater good and to his destiny to found Rome. And this is an example of what I talked about at the beginning of my discussion of the Aeneid, where I said how the value system of the Aeneid is different from the heroic value system. Aeneas's individual wants don't matter ultimately unless they coincide with the larger good. Aeneas's fate is to found the Roman people. And anything that gets in the way of that, he's just going to have to give up. This is what makes Aeneas a Roman hero, a specifically Roman hero, as opposed to just an epic hero. that he will give up everything else in order to make sure he does his duty. His duty is to found Rome. He has to do it. He has to leave Carthage. He has to go to Italy. He doesn't want to. If he had his way, he would not. But he doesn't have that choice. He is forced to leave Dido and to go and found Rome. Dido doesn't know this, of course, and we see here on the slide that Dido's reaction continues to not be very good. Aeneas doesn't tell her that he's having to, get rid of his own desire for duty. And she just thinks he's cold and also very confusing. So this slide shows her talking to her sister. She tries to get her sister to intervene. And love and hope are gone at this point. She has no hope of continuing the relationship. And she just asks that he give her time. Moreover, we continue to see this combination of love or emotion and practicality. She points out, rightly, that he is foolish to be leaving at this time of year because it's bad for sailing. The weather there were a lot of storms at this time of year. There were only certain times of the year that people tended to sail in antiquity, and Aeneas is trying to leave immediately before it's the time for sailing. But he doesn't give in. And I would argue that the reason he doesn't give in is because he's only barely resisting his own desires. He's only barely managing to follow his duty and do what he's supposed to do. And that Aeneas knows that if he stays in Carthage, he'll never leave, even if he just delays for a few weeks. So once she realizes that Aeneas is really leaving, that there's nothing that's going to even delay him, Dido resolves on suicide, as we can see in this slide. So she decides to die, and then she starts working on the way to do it. She has a variety of reasons. Certainly her emotions are part of it. She's overcome by anguish. She harbors the madness. But, she also has some practical reasons. She knows that she has angered their neighbors, and she may hope that by killing herself, she can deflect the anger of Iarbas and the other neighboring kings away from her people. Roman attitudes about suicide also play in here. For the Romans, there was no shame in committing suicide if you had reached a point in your life where it was going to be worse to continue living than to die. It was considered to be a perfectly logical, reasonable, and honorable choice to commit suicide in some circumstances. Going back to Cleopatra and Antony, for instance, Mark Antony killed himself when it became clear that he was not going to win against Augustus. He committed suicide rather than have to be put on trial for treason or something like that. It was much less shameful for him to commit suicide. And Cleopatra also committed suicide to avoid actually being a prisoner in Octavian's triumph. So Dido is committing suicide, again, to avoid a worse fate, basically. All right. But before she can commit suicide, we have yet another turn of her emotional state. So Dido, over the course of this book of this poem, her emotions turn from love to hate. Romans did connect strong emotions. They felt there wasn't necessarily that much of a difference between extreme good emotions and extreme bad emotions. And they certainly felt that love could easily turn to hate. And again, we saw this in Catullus, where he's struggling between loving Lesbia and hating her, which connects Dido here to the lovers in love poetry, with this being torn between love and hate. It also shows a great deal of emotional turmoil on Dido's part. And remember that Dido has been manipulated by deities. Her love did not spring naturally. It came because deities decided she should fall in love and she should break her vows and she should destroy herself purely for their own machinations. And then in this slide, we see that Jupiter sends Mercury again. Jupiter is aware of Dido's turn to anger. And Jupiter is concerned that Aeneas has been taking too long to get out of Carthage. And so he sends Mercury again to warn Aeneas that he needs to go now. Mercury suggests that Dido's anger is soon going to turn destructive and that she is going to take revenge on Aeneas and his men. He also suggests that she is deceitful, she broods on mortal deceit, and that she is fickle and changeable. But again, here is the question. Is she deceitful? Has she changed? And if so, is this any more or less true of her than of Aeneas? I'll leave you to think about whether those questions, what you might answer for those questions. Okay, so now we are in the final stretch with the Aeneid. As we have this slide, which has Dido's curse on it. So the ultimate result of Dido's anger is not destruction for Aeneas. It is put off. Mercury warns him in time. He gets away. But Dido says, "Then, O Tyrians, pursue my hatred against his whole line and the race to come, and offer it as a tribute to my ashes. Let there be no love or treaties between our peoples. Rise some unknown avenger from my dust who will pursue the Trojan colonists with fire and sword, now or in time to come, whenever the strength is granted him. I pray that shore be opposed to shore, water to water, weapon to weapon. Let them fight, them and their descendants." This is Dido's curse, and this is the curse that leads to the wars between Carthage and Rome in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Well, retroactively, it leads to these wars. As I said, Virgil is very interested in the Aeneid, in the idea of Roman history. And a lot of things that he writes about in the Aeneid are used almost as foreshadowing for the history that is to come after the Aeneid, but of course before Virgil. And so here he is foreshadowing the conflict between Carthage and Rome, and he's also explaining it. This is another thing that Virgil likes to do in this poem, is to use this legendary time period to explain later things in Roman history. So this love gone wrong between Aeneas and Dido is the ultimate cause of the conflict between Carthage and Rome. Ironically, it is also the cause to some extent of Rome's greatness. So Dido orders her people to fight with Rome to the very end, but Rome wins that war. And the wealth and power that Rome gains when it conquers Carthage and Carthage's territories is the beginning of Rome's empire outside of Italy. It's its first step to world domination. So Dido's insistence that her descendants fight Aeneas actually leads to Rome's greatness indirectly. Which just goes to show that you can't fight fate. Juno may have tried to stop Aeneas from founding Rome, but it turned out her sneaky methods just will in the end make Rome greater. And then we have Dido's death. Dido climbed the tall funeral pyre and unsheathed the Trojan sword, a gift that was never acquired to this end. Then as she saw the Ilian clothing and the familiar couch, she lingered a while in tears, and thought, then cast herself on the bed. So Dido's death appears on a pyre, or happens on a pyre. Dido has, for various other reasons, got her sister and some other people to help her pile up everything she associates with Aeneas in a courtyard. Now, everyone else, her sister and her handmaidens, thinks that Dido is going to burn all of this stuff to basically set her free of her love for Aeneas, to symbolically get him out of her mind. What they don't know is that she actually intends to kill herself on this pile and then to make it her funeral pyre. So what does she kill herself with? What is she going to kill herself with? A Trojan sword. She is going to kill herself with a sword that Aeneas gave her. And where is she going to kill herself? On their bed. On the bed she shared with Aeneas with a gift he gave her. This is very heavy symbolism, and it actually goes back to those first lines of this book about how Dido is pierced by love and bleeding and burning. The fire and the wound of the initial lines of this book are going to become literal at the very end. Dido delivers a speech, and then she actually dies, or she kills herself in this slide here. Dido's death, she falls on a sword, much like Mark Antony had. But her death takes quite a while. If you look at, I've put a little ellipses in between where she actually stabs herself, and then, 30 lines later, she's still dying. She tries to lift herself up. She keeps falling back on the bed, but she doesn't die. This is a very lingering death for a suicide. And the reason it is delayed is because she's not supposed to die now. Ancient myth imagined there being a set of fates, and when every child was born, the child would be given a certain allotment of light. If you've seen the Disney movie Hercules, you might remember this from the very beginning of it. Dido has not yet run out the length of life she was supposed to live. She's not supposed to die right now. Aeneas has interfered with her fate. And ultimately, Juno has to personally intervene and send a goddess down to let Dido free, to let her die. So that is the end of Dido. That is the end of Dido and Aeneas' love story. Except it isn't quite the end, as we see on this slide here. Because in Aeneid 6, Aeneas goes to the underworld, and while he's there, he meets her ghost. And I've given you the lines if you want to look up the passage yourself. Aeneas meets Dido's ghost. He encounters her, and I will read the passage for you. As I said, I've given you the lines so that you can look it up on the website if you want. But in just 1 second, I'm going to grab the passage and I'll read it for you, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, so here we have the Shade of Dido. So this is Aeneas meeting Dido's ghost in the underworld. Among the ghosts, Phoenician Dido wandered. In the great wood, her wound still fresh. As soon as the Trojan hero stood near her, and knew her, shadowy among the shadows, like a man who sees, or thinks he sees, the new moon rising through a cloud, as its month begins. He wept tears and spoke to her with tender affection. Dido, unhappy spirit, was the news that came to me of your death then true, taking your life with a blade? Alas, was I the cause of your dying? I swear by the stars, by the gods above, by whatever truth may be in the depths of the earth, I left your shores unwillingly, my queen. I was commanded by gods, who drove me by their decrees, that now force me to go among the shades, through places thorny with neglect, and deep as night. Nor did I think my leaving there would ever bring such grief to you. Halt your footsteps, and do not take yourself from my sight. What do you flee? This is the last speech with you that fate allows. With such words Aeneas would have calmed her fiery spirit and wild looks, and provoked her tears. She turned away, her eyes fixed on the ground, no more altered in expression by the speech he had begun than if hard flint stood there, or a cliff of Parian marble. At last she tore herself away, and, hostile to him, fled to the shadowy grove where Zacchaeus, her husband in former times, responded to her suffering and gave her love for love. Aeneas, no less shaken by the injustice of fate, followed her far off with his tears and pitied her as she went. So he travels to the underworld. He encounters her ghost. He tries to talk to her. Finally, he tries to tell her everything that he wanted to say when he was in Carthage, that he did not want to leave, that he was being forced to go against his will. But it's too late. She won't listen. And she walks away and joins the ghost of her first husband, Zacchaeus. So I'd ask you, does this coda to the story of Dido and Aeneas change Book 4? Change how we view it and how we view Aeneas' actions in it? Does it change anything? If it does make him seem more pitiable, I suppose. But does it make him seem less harsh? Does it make him seem less blameworthy for what happened? So think on those kind of questions. And then finally, we have our questions to consider, which I encourage you to think about as you are reviewing this lecture and the material presented in it. That is all that I have today for this lecture on Love Gone Wrong. I will return next week, and we will learn about... What will we learn about? Let me just double check here. So next week we'll be learning about love games. We'll be reading The Art of Love, Book 1. Remember, if you're in the third group of people, if your last name is, I think, N to Z, you have a assignment due next week. If your assignment is due this week, and that means if your last name is from G to M, please make sure you email me that assignment by the end of class time today, so by 4 o'clock on January 29th, and I will consider it handed in on time as long as you get it to me by then, and I will return it to you next week. But yeah, so that is everything for today. I think that I might have a little dog who wants to come in and say hello. Let's just check that. Tubbs just had a bath, and he's wearing a bow tie. Oh, and he's eating all these treats. Dance, Chubbs. Dance. Oh, that's a pretty good dance. Oh my goodness, you're very vicious. Okay, you say hello? Say hello, students. Okay. He just shook water everywhere. Bye.